Welcome to my weekly meditation. And know that no matter who you are or where you are in your life journey, you are welcome in this place. This is a weekly video that I do for my congregation in South Burlington. And so if you are looking to nurture a progressive faith and you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, subscribe, or share these videos with anyone you feel called to. Our reading today comes from Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 39. A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher, and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear those who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. And even the hairs on your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. Whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foe will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. So, Jesus' ministry was a ministry that was rooted in love. It was also rooted in peace and trying to bring healing and wholeness to this world. And so I think that many Christians, especially those who are rooted in a more progressive tradition, find it confusing when we have this passage from Matthew 10 where Jesus says, I'm not here to bring peace, I'm here to bring the sword. I am not here to bring harmony between fathers and sons, daughters and mothers, or stepmothers and stepdaughters, or vice versa. But rather, I am here to bring conflict. I think it's very alarming for us when we hear this passage and Jesus is saying, those who stand up for me, I will speak to my Father in heaven, but those who do not, I will not speak to for my Father in heaven. Because this language, this very angry, this very confrontational side of Jesus is not the side of Jesus that we feel comfortable with. But I think that it is important for us to understand that the type of peace and the type of love that Jesus is trying to bring to the world is a type of love that is maybe different than our understanding of it. Jesus is talking about God's love. Jesus is talking about God's peace. And the ways in which we love each other in the world today, the ways in which we bring peace to the world today, are not always rooted in God. They're not always rooted in justice. And so what Jesus is telling his disciples here is that it is our job to shake things up. It's our job to shake off the muck that manages to cling itself on to our human lives and to really let God's love shine. We struggle with that because As people who want to love, people who want peace in the world, we often feel like we're trying really hard to do that. And it can be difficult when we're called out on the ways in which we fail to understand God's love in the world. The way in which Jesus is calling out folks who fail to understand God's love in the world. Very often, those folks who fail to understand God's love are the people that we are most connected to. This is the reason why Jesus says that the disciple should emulate their teacher. The slave should emulate their master. Keep in mind that he's speaking from a first century mindset. We should try to follow the example of those who are rooted in God's love, as opposed to the example of those who are rooted in something different. He used Beelzebub as an example. Those who are rooted in a demonic type of hate was his example. Because if we follow somebody who is preaching hate, or even preaching a message that is mixed with hate, that hate's going to become a part of who we are. And so this passage from Matthew 10 really is meant to wake us up to a reality that can be very disturbing for us. What we think is love is not always love. What we think is peace is not always peace. We have a responsibility to find God's peace. We have a responsibility to find God's love. And let me speak a little bit to what that may look like, even though I don't claim to have the answers here. But we are living through an era of reckoning. In 2020, after George Floyd was killed, people really paid attention to systemic racism within our society, within policing, within the prison system, within the housing market with redlining. And we entered into a time where people really were committed to educating themselves on the way in which racism is still present within our society today. I think there was a recognition in 2020 among many people, especially people who I was ministering to, that the story about racism that we were told here in this country was incomplete. I know growing up in Vermont, the story that I was told felt like Dr. King beat racism, and that was it. And now we are an enlightened society, and racism is no more. That is not a true story. That is something that I think a lot of people want to believe, and I think that there are a lot of people in the world who still believe it, even if they don't necessarily think along those lines, that racism is not a problem anymore. And so it is hard for a lot of people in the world today to read, for instance, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, or to watch the movie 13 about the prison systems and the justice system in America today, and how it is, in a lot of ways, organized to put low income and black people, men in particular, behind bars, because those groups were identified as people to be feared. When we hear that information, when we have the evidence thrown in our face, it can be hard for people who are well-meaning to recognize that there are errors in the ways in which they've been living their lives. And I think that these in particular are the people that Jesus is speaking to here in this passage. You want to follow God. You're being told you're following God. But what you're following has little nuggets of mistruth and hate, and maybe even a little bit of willful ignorance mixed into it. We should talk as well about our brothers and sisters in the Southern Baptist Convention, who it seems are backsliding in a way that we never thought would happen, even within the religious culture of the United States today. The Southern Baptist Convention is denying the leadership of women within the church. This means that they are kicking out congregations that have women as ministers or as associate ministers or as deacons. And they are taking on a hardline stance that you find within the Bible, because the Bible does say this, that men should be the leaders of the church, that men are elevated above women when it comes to the view of God. And while that is in the Bible, that is in a certain part of the Bible. And there are other parts of the Bible that contradict this. If we look at the example that Jesus Christ gives us when he says, love God, love your neighbor, he doesn't go on to say, well, you know, God loves men more than women. And if we look at other places in the Bible, for instance, if we look at the letters of Paul that are actually written by Paul, Paul lifts up women. In particular, he lifts up the dye merchant Lydia, who pays him his money to be a minister himself, as being important leaders of the church. And in a lot of ways, he recognizes women as a foundational force within the church. The church today would not exist if it was not for women forming the backbone of the church. And yes, very often men got credit for that hard work. But over a long span of time, eventually we understood that if we are going to minister God's love appropriately to the world, women need to be included in leadership roles officially, because women have always been leaders within the Christian church. And it is wrong for us to deny the impact of the love that they have given to the institution of the church. For those of us who are willing to recognize that legacy of love that played out over a long period of time, as opposed to focusing in on certain passages of the Bible where it says something that maybe we want to hear or something that we are comfortable with, and saying that that must be the end of the story. Well, for those of us who don't do that, we can see just how harmful it is when we allow ourselves to be led by a call that doesn't come from God, that doesn't reflect God's love. Those of us who are willing to search for God's love, who are willing to recognize that we do not have all the answers, are going to find ourselves a place in God's realm, because we're actually looking for it. Those of us who refuse to look are never going to find the fullness of God, and that is tragic, but Jesus tells us that that is true. And therefore we need to get ourselves out of this headspace where we think that we have all the answers, that it's okay for us to persecute, to condemn, and to exclude others because they are different than us, because they have a different gender than us, because they have a different racial or ethnic background than us. That is wrong. And even though Jesus is using very confrontational language here, what he is essentially saying is, without justice in the world, there will be no peace. And therefore, those of us who want God's justice to enter into the world, we need to be willing to mix things up. We need to be willing to speak that truth, even if it pits us against those whom we love the most. It is difficult when Jesus says that you got to love God more than you love your father. You got to love God more than you love your mother. You got to love God more than you love your sister and brother. Because oftentimes those conflicts are very personal. They are very tough for us to deal with when it comes to talking about what God's love in the world really should look like. Very often it is the people who are closest to us who have a different understanding of God, or who are rooted in something that is peppered with hate or misogyny or racism, and we need to call it out. If we want to see love actually enter into the world, we got to be willing to call it out. We got to be willing to bring the sword, as Jesus puts it, into our lives if we're going to find real peace, real love in the world today. And so, yeah, this passage really feels uncomfortable because Jesus didn't come to the world to preach us a message that was going to make us feel comfortable. Jesus didn't want us to sit in a circle and just kumbaya our way into heaven. Jesus wanted us to confront the forces of injustice within the world wherever they were, not just on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem, not just in the capital of our nations or of our states, or within the systems of government that we find ourselves living in, but within our very homes and within our very lives. Jesus tells us to look at ourselves, those places where we are most comfortable, and to recognize the things that we are doing wrong and to change them. That stinks. But if we're not willing to do that, we're not really following the path that Jesus is calling us to.